Okay, here we go. So the video I've just done posted about waffling about the Scargatherer series said I'm going to start reading you The Leopard in the Golden Cage. I'm ready. I have got my cup of tea in my Shakespearean insult mug given to me by a very good friend, because clearly you save your best insults for your best friend. I have supplies. It's not quite full. I didn't eat all of that. Somebody else said that. Chocolate's supposed to be good for your voice though, so I thought, I might need to eat chocolate as soon as I finish. I probably won't eat chocolate in the middle of it because you might just feel left out. So I'm going to read you the first chapter of The Leopard in the Golden Cage. As I already mentioned on the other video, it's mirror image, so sorry about that, but I'm not faffing around with mirrors anymore to make it look the right way around. So here we go. You'll just have to put up with me learning to do this better as I go along. This is going to be more like a bedtime story from your mum and dad than like an actual, audible or anything like that. So, bedtime story from your parents. Think in that zone. And I'll try not to make too many mistakes. Okay, so The Leopard in the Golden Cage. First book in the Scargatherer series, chapter 1. Joe sat at the kitchen table and stared out of the window, his chin on his hand. "Hurry up," said his mum. "The others will be here soon. We need to get ready to go." "It's not fair," Joe grumbled. "How come Sam gets to take a friend and I don't?" "We can't fit anyone else in the car. You can take someone next time we go out for the day." Joe went back to eating his cornflakes. Ben was Sam's best friend, and his mum, Kate, was Mum's best friend. So Sam and Mum would be taking their friends. It was just Joe who would be on his own. He went upstairs to brush his teeth, wishing that Dad was coming with them. Today was the first day of the summer holidays. In 19 days, Joe and Sam were going to stay with Dad for a week. Joe knew it wasn't fair on Mum to be looking forward to it so much, but he couldn't help it. As for the other 5 weeks, the thought of them filled him with misery. He rinsed his hands under the tap and ran them through his hair. It was blonde and a little bit wavy, and it stuck up with the water. He flattened it down and peered at himself in the mirror. There was nothing special about him that would ever make him stand out. Hazel eyes, average height, neither skinny nor fat. He would be 11 in September. Sam, who was 13, was loads taller. Joe sighed. One day he would catch up with his brother. The doorbell rang. "Hurry up, please, Joe," his mum called from the foot of the stairs. It was crowded on the back seat of the car, with Sam, Ben and Joe all squeezed in together. They drove for what seemed like a long time. "How much further?" Joe asked eventually. "Not long now." "Where are we going again?" "It's called Fishbourne Roman Palace," said Kate. "There was once a huge villa there. We're going to look at the ruins and the museum." "Sounds a bit boring," said Ben. "It won't be," Kate said. "They've got some amazing mosaics. You know, those floors made of thousands of tiny tiles. They're really, really old. There's one that's quite famous, a boy riding a dolphin." Joe looked out of the window at the passing trees and houses. Normally he liked ruined castles and that kind of thing, but normally they went with Dad, who told such incredibly vivid stories about places that you felt like you'd actually been there. They drove on through a housing estate and came to a barrier on the road. "Here we are then, the gateway to the palace," Joe's mum said, in that falsely bright voice she used so often at the moment. They paid for their tickets at the entrance. "There's a film about the palace," said the lady at the ticket desk. "I suggest you start by watching that. It'll give you an idea of what you're looking at." Joe followed his mum and Kate into the auditorium. It was very dark. He sat down at the end of the row and hunched his shoulders. Sam and Ben whispered and sniggered together. The film was sort of interesting, Joe thought, with its computer graphics showing what the palace might have looked like. But when they stepped out into the daylight again, he was disappointed to see that half of it was now underneath the backs of houses all around. In fact, there was only half of the garden and the floor of one section of the palace left. He wished he could wave a magic wand and make it all reappear. "Let's go and have a look at the mosaics," Mum said. Joe trailed after her. Sam and Ben larked around, their feet booming on the wooden walkways. "Here it is," called Sam. "Here's the famous one." His voice echoed beneath the high ceiling of the museum building. "Look at that!" Kate leaned on the rail. "Isn't it beautiful?" Joe went along the walkway on the other side from them. If Dad had been here, he would have been describing the man laying the mosaic, crawling around with his trays of tile fragments, and his plan, grumbling about his stiff back or his sore knees, or his apprentice making the mortar too sloppy so that the tiles slipped. Joe reached inside the neck of his t-shirt to touch the St. Christopher Dad had given him just before he moved out. He held it between his finger and thumb, pressing it hard, as though he could conjure Dad out of thin air. Nothing happened, of course. He looked down at it. Hang on, I'm just going to stop here, because I actually have this thing, and I'm going to show it to you. See, I told you this would be more like a bedtime story and not quite so much like somebody just reading. Look, here it is. This is Joe St. Christopher. Okay. Now, because this is a video, you can see it much closer up than kids usually get to see it. It's not very in focus though, is it? Anyway, it's a necklace with a picture of St. Christopher on it. He's supposed to be the patron saint of travellers. So he's supposed to keep you safe if you're travelling. Anyway, so where were we? Joe held it between his finger and thumb, pressing hard, as though he could conjure Dad out of thin air. Nothing happened, of course. He looked down at it, but the chain it was on was too short for him to really see it. Without thinking, he gave it a tug. There was a snapping sound. The chain slithered down his neck. He fumbled to catch it, but as he did so, the St. Christopher slipped from his fingers. There was a tinkling sound as it bounced on the mosaic floor. Then it rolled away beneath the walkway. "Oh no!" he cried out. "What's the matter?" His mum turned back towards him from the next mosaic. "I've dropped my St. Christopher." "Silly boy." Joe could tell that Mum was annoyed, even though she was pretending not to be. "We'll have to ask if someone can get it for you." For the next 5 minutes, there was a lot of fuss while Joe's mum asked at the ticket desk, and the ticket desk sent someone off to find someone else. Joe leaned out over the rail as far as he could, trying desperately to see the St. Christopher, embarrassed at the trouble he'd caused. The guide came along and climbed down from the walkway, tiptoeing around the edge of the mosaic. "I can't see anything." He got down on his hands and knees. "You do mean a little silver disc, a bit smaller than a 10-pence piece?" Joe nodded. The guide crawled around the edge of the floor. "Doesn't seem to be on the mosaic, but I can't see it under the walkway either." After another minute he stood up. "I'm really sorry, young man, but I'm afraid it's well and truly disappeared. No sign of the chain either. Maybe they've got caught in your clothes." Joe swallowed. He knew they hadn't. "Never mind, darling." His mum put her arm around him. "We'll have to get you another one." Joe hung his head. Another one wouldn't be the same. And what was he going to tell Dad? "Let's go and have something to eat." But Joe was dejected as he ate his packed lunch. "I need to go to the loo," he said after a few minutes. "Well, you know where we are," Mum said. "We won't go anywhere without you." Back inside the museum, Joe went straight to where he had dropped the St. Christopher. It simply had to be there somewhere. It wasn't possible that it had disappeared. He looked all around. There were a couple of families down at the far end of the building, but most people had gone off for lunch. If he was really quick, he might get away with having a look for himself. After glancing around one more time, he slipped through the rails and dropped down onto the mosaic. There was a hissing sound, like air escaping from a punctured tyre. It was probably some kind of air conditioning, he thought. He crawled forward on his hands and knees beneath the walkway. He'd had the impression before that there were lights underneath, shining across the mosaic. But now that he was down here, it seemed quite dark. There was a big piece of furniture under here too, a heavy wooden sideboard of some kind. The edges of the tiles were slightly rough against his palm. The design on this side of the picture looked different, close up, to how it had looked from above. He frowned. He was sure there had been swirling circles before. But beneath his hands was a square zigzag design, like the battlements of a castle. In the dim light, it looked black and white rather than coloured. He swept his hand along underneath the sideboard. There was a lot of dust, but he couldn't feel his St. Christopher. "What are you doing?" Joe jumped guiltily to his feet. The room seemed to rush in on him. He swayed and blinked. The museum had vanished. The dolphin mosaic had vanished too. He stood on a black and white floor in a much smaller room. "Don't worry, I won't bite." A girl with dark hair stood in the doorway. She was wearing a long, pale dress and sandals. Joe stared. A few moments before, there had been no doorway. There had been no walls in which to have a doorway. Now there were walls and a ceiling, a couch, a low table, and on one side a small kind of wood burner. The room was dim. Apart from the doorway, the only light came from windows with greenish-blue glass at the top of the walls. "Who are you?" he asked. "I should be asking you that. I live here. You don't." "Really? You live here? In a museum?" The girl laughed. "It's not a museum. It's a palace, and I am Celestia Lucilia, second daughter of Gaius Sallustius Lucullus." "Who's he when he's at home?" Joe asked. She looked shocked. "He is the owner of this palace and the Propraetorian Imperial Legate to the Emperor Domitian himself." She drew herself up tall. "What's a property imperial whatever it was?" Joe frowned. The girl stuck her nose in the air. "He is the governor of Britannia and the most important man in the land, and I am his daughter." Joe shook his head. "You can't be. Are you here for some kind of fancy dress day?" "What's fancy dress?" She dropped her haughty manner. Joe pointed at her costume. "Those clothes. You look like you're dressed up." She smoothed her skirt with her hands. "This is my best dress, actually. We've got visitors coming, so my mother wanted us all to look nice." "Oh, right." Joe could hear that he sounded unfriendly, but it irritated him that she was pretending not to understand him. "What I mean is, nobody wears that kind of thing normally. Most people wear this kind of—" He glanced down at himself to indicate his shorts and t-shirt. But the clothes he put on this morning had completely changed. He was wearing a loose tunic with a belt around the middle and leather sandals similar to the girls' ones. He touched the fabric of the tunic. It felt real enough, smooth rather than scratchy, like a kind of heavy cotton. He gaped at it. "What's going on?" "Nothing's going on," she said. "Are you one of my cousins? We're expecting a lot of people, but I didn't think any of them had arrived." "No, I'm Joe." He hesitated, then said, "Well, in fact, I'm Joseph Edward Hopkins." "That's a funny name." "No, it's not." Joe was indignant. "It's your name that's strange. What did you say it was?" "Celestia Lucilia," she repeated primly. "Celestia?" He wrinkled his nose. "I've never heard that before. Don't people call you Sally for short?" She gave him a look. as though he'd asked a stupid question. Nobody calls me either Celestia or Sally, but there's nothing strange about the name. Both of my sisters are called Celestia as well. My older sister is Celestia Domitia. She's nearly 14, and my younger sister is Celestia Antonia. She's 8. I'm 10. Me too, said Joe, though I'll be 11 soon, he added hastily. Isn't it a bit confusing if you all have the same name? Of course not, the girl said. Only my older sister is actually called Celestia. My little sister is Antonia, and I'm Lucilia. Lucilia, Joe repeated. That's still a bit of a frilly name. Can I call you Lucy? The girl looked doubtful. If you must, she said, pursing her lips. Anyway, you still haven't answered my question. What were you doing when I came in? I was looking for something I dropped earlier. My St. Christopher. What's that? It's like a medallion. You wear it round your neck. St. Christopher is the patron saint of travellers, so it's supposed to keep you safe if you're travelling. A bit like this. Her hand went to her throat. On a leather thong around her neck hung a circular gold pendant. It had curved surfaces that reminded Joe of a sherbet flying saucer. This bulla belonged to my brother, she said. When he died, they were going to bury it with him, but they decided to give it to me instead. Joe's mouth fell open. If Sam died, he couldn't imagine talking about it in such a matter-of-fact way. They're to ward off evil spirits, she went on. You don't believe in that kind of thing, do you? Joe said. Her eyes widened. Of course. In fact, now I think about it, you could be an evil spirit. You're obviously not my cousin, and how else have you appeared here out of the blue? I didn't appear out of the blue, he said crossly. I came with my mum and my brother and their friends. He stopped. He'd come to the museum with them, but this wasn't a museum anymore. His mind struggled to get a grip on what was happening to him. It was impossible. More than that, it was completely unbelievable. But there was no other way to explain it. He seemed to have slipped through time. Well, never mind, Lucy said. If you're a spirit, perhaps you're a good one. But even so, you shouldn't be in here. I shouldn't be in here either. These rooms are for guests. We live over on the other side. Shall I show you? She put her head out into the corridor and looked both ways, then drew herself up sharply against the wall. There's someone coming, she whispered. We'll have to hide. She looked around in a panic. I'll be in such trouble if I get caught. She darted round behind the couch. You too, she hissed. Joe could hear the footsteps outside now. Despite Lucy's obvious anxiety, he found it hard to be worried. It was all so unreal. Get down! Lucy grabbed the hem of his tunic and pulled him down behind the couch next to her. The doorway darkened as someone walked into the room. Joe wanted to peep out and see who it was. Lucy shook her head silently. The footsteps retreated. Joe stood up. There was now a huge bowl of fruit on the table. He went over and picked up a peach. It was soft and downy, just like at home, but it smelled like the ripest, sweetest peach he had ever eaten. He was about to bite into it when Lucy caught hold of his arm. What are you doing? Put it back. We need to get out of here. Her face was pale. Come on, before anyone else comes. That was only a slave. Next time it'll be my mother, coming to see if everything's ready for the guests. Reluctantly, Joe put the peach back in the bowl and followed her out across the corridor, through a courtyard and into a kind of cloister with pillars and a roof. Right. Lucy's colour had come back into her cheeks. We need to decide what on earth to do with you. So that's the end of chapter 1 of The Leopard in the Golden Cage. For anybody who's come online while I've been reading it, sorry about the mirror image. That's the phone for you. Joe Hopkins 10 years old. He's just slipped back into Roman Britain. He's just met Lucy. She will be his guide to all things Roman. There are all sorts of things that are going to come up. If I've visited your school already, you'll know already that we talked about Roman loos. I always talk about the loos in every book because it's a part of our day-to-day life and it's different in every era. Also, Roman toothpaste. You might remember the ingredients in Roman toothpaste. If you don't, that will be coming up in a couple of chapters' time. Roman hair dye. Joe has to have his hair dyed because he's about like me, kind of this sort of colour, and he needs his hair to be black to look like a Roman, or very dark. So he has his hair dyed. Some of you may already remember what's in the Roman hair dye. If you don't, that'll be coming up in a few chapters as well. There's also a leopard. There's a golden cage. I'm not going to talk to you about those now. I'm actually going to stop, and I'll see you again tomorrow. If you think this is a good idea, you'd like to join in, I'll probably try and do it around the same time tomorrow. Let's say 10:30 tomorrow. I don't think there's any reason why I shouldn't. But anyway, if you miss me live, then you can pick up later on. Okay, because these will all be on the Facebook Scargatherer webpage. And if you want any more information about the series, I wrote this little thing. Here it is. Okay, that is the website for the Scargatherer. If you want to read along with me, you can get the books there. I will still be going out to the post office, so if you get them from me, they'll be signed, yay, with a bookmark and everything. Otherwise, you can get them from Amazon. But there's loads of stuff on here, so if anybody's stuck at home and wants something to do, there's quizzes and word searches and timelines and all sorts. So yeah, that's where to go for more information. All right, I think that's enough.